see dead people.
It's one of the most memorable lines in modern cinema history. Back in the summer of 1999, everyone and their dead grandmother was saying those words in hushed tones, imitating young Cole Sear, the haunted protagonist of The Sixth Sense, which was as big of a cultural phenomenon as movies had seen in years at the time. Thanks to an effective trailer, a word-of-mouth buzz that could not be ignored, the overall high quality of the product itself, and of course, that shocker of an ending, The Sixth Sense was one of those rare things at the cinema, a movie you simply could not miss. Unless you didn't mind being left out of the conversation completely. And most of the success was thanks to that one very compelling admission: I see dead people. But that now infamous line almost wasn't in the original script. In fact, neither was the equally infamous twist ending. Like so many other movies, The Sixth Sense changed quite a bit before it hit theaters. And if its savvy writer-director M. Night Shyamalan hadn't been so determined to make a movie that was an instant classic, it might never have been made at all. Huddle up in your safety tent and stay with us until the surprise ending as we find out what happened to The Sixth Sense.
How can you help me if you don't believe me?
It's not any kind of revelation to say that back in 1999, M. Night Shyamalan was not a household name. He had made 2 films at that point. The first was Praying with Anger, which he'd made while still attending NYU, using money borrowed from friends and family. The second was a coming-of-age drama called Wide Awake, which was made in 1995 but not released until 1998. Wide Awake was a miserable experience for a night, thanks to one man who had made plenty of people in Hollywood miserable: Harvey Weinstein. Weinstein's poor treatment of Shyamalan and Wide Awake stung the director profoundly, prompting him to vow to never work under such conditions again. Night was determined to write and ultimately direct a screenplay that was so good, it would ensure he'd be able to call his own shots from then on. Of course, now he had to actually write it. Night had been interested in ghosts ever since he was a kid, and wanted to tell a story that used troubled spirits as the catalyst for a grounded and sensitive drama about the afterlife. Trouble was, coming up with the right hook was not easy. Night wrote a couple of drafts that he considered garbage, threw them out, and started over. Always a page 1 rewrite. In some of the early drafts, a serial killer figured into the plot, and the lead character was a crime scene photographer. At a certain point, the figure of a hypersensitive child who could communicate with ghosts came to him, finally giving him a protagonist that he could work with. The line, "I see dead people," was put in the script, then taken out, put back in, and so on. The script still needed something else to ensure that it wasn't just another supernatural thriller, but something much more effective and memorable. Finally, like a helpful spirit, the ending emerged to him as if out of a dream. Hopefully you know the ending. We're going to guess that you do.
I think I'm okay, really. I think it just went in and out. It doesn't even hurt anymore.
With that humdinger of a finale in his back pocket, Night's confidence in his script suddenly skyrocketed. Now every character seemed clear to him. Every scene of suspense was much more vivid. The human drama became that much more personal and emotional. That groundbreaking movie that he'd been envisioning after the gut punch of the Wide Awake experience was in Night's hands. Still, it took him at least 10 drafts to get to where he wanted. Night has seemingly never lacked for confidence, and though he was still unproven and unknown, his belief in his script was so strong that he was going to gamble heavily on it, and himself. Night had instructions for his agent when it came to selling the script. It would go out to all major studios in town via messenger at the exact same time. The minimum bid for The Sixth Sense was to be $1 million, with a guarantee that Night would sit the director's chair as well. Years later, Night admitted that he was not bluffing with those requests, and if no studio had bitten, he would have simply shelved the project, perhaps forever. 4 studios passed on the script, but a couple of others were able to get into a bidding war for it: DreamWorks, New Line Cinema, and Disney. New Line initially offered $2 million, which probably would have blown M. Night away, but had Disney not bettered them with an offer of $3 million for the screenplay and another $500,000 for Night to direct. Naturally, that's the deal that Knight took. He'd made $3.5 million in the span of an afternoon, and he wasn't even 30 years old yet. With Knight firmly ensconced in the director's chair, it was time to cast his film. Knight had had Bruce Willis in mind when writing the role of Malcolm Crowe, the child psychologist whose job it is to reach a frightened young boy who claims that he sees dead people. After Bruce received and read the script, he quickly said yes. He admitted to being blown away by the ending and foresaw that audiences would similarly be startled by it. That said, Bruce was obviously intent on not playing the role with the surprise in mind, saying in an interview that he had to forget about the fact that his character was a ghost while acting. Knight liked the idea of subverting Bruce's action hero image with a kinder, gentler role that would hopefully surprise an unsuspected audience. But the role of young Cole Sear was the most crucial. A 9-year-old boy constantly beset by horrific visions, Cole had to be pitiable and vulnerable, but with considerable inner strength. The role required a real actor. Naturally, the casting director saw loads of young actors, including Michael Cera, if you can picture that. But one youngster stood out, Haley Joel Osment. Haley was by no means a newbie to the acting scene, having been cast in several TV shows and movies. Most notably, he played Forrest's son in 1994's Forrest Gump. Osment's father, who was an actor as well, would help him prepare for his auditions, so when he went in for The Sixth Sense, he was very well prepped. Osment recollected that he'd spent so much time with his lines beforehand that he was very ready for his audition by the time that he met with Knight. He even wore a suit to his first meeting. While Osment impressed during his early audition, Knight was hesitant to cast him. He had pictured Cole to be a darker, more brooding character, and Haley was, as Knight put it, a sweet cherub, a beautiful blonde-haired boy. But after Haley's second audition, Knight knew he had his guy, saying watching Haley's performance made him feel as though he'd never heard the dialogue before, and that Haley got to the core of Cole's vulnerability and need. The audition left both Knight and Haley in tears, and Haley with a job, one probably a lot bigger than he had anticipated at the time. The third most important role in the film is that of Cole's working-class mother, Lynn. Toni Collette happened to be in New York to meet Martin Scorsese for a role in Bringing Out the Dead, and while in town, got the script for The Sixth Sense. While she was very impressed by the script and her subsequent meeting with Knight, Toni's sights were fully set on the Scorsese film. She was contacted by her agents and told she was offered the part, and in her excitement, she thought that they meant Bringing Out the Dead, but instead they meant Knight's film. Slightly disappointed that she didn't get the film that she really wanted, Collette eventually found the experience of making The Sixth Sense incredibly rewarding, even helping to craft the character's look, from the wig right down to clothes she went out and bought herself. Working with Haley was especially notable for Toni, who would break down in very real tears for the classic sequence at the end, where Cole finally reveals his secret to his mother. But no actor threw themselves into their work more than Donnie Wahlberg, who only gets a handful of minutes of screen times as Vincent Gray, a former patient of Malcolm Crowe's. Wahlberg, probably still best known as a member of New Kids on the Block at the time, starved himself for weeks ahead of shooting, losing approximately 40 pounds in an alarmingly short amount of time. So committed to his character's headspace was Wahlberg that one night while he and a friend were strolling around Philadelphia improvising lines, Wahlberg freaked out and ran off, hiding in bushes and creeping through the streets in the early morning hours. He didn't want to go back to his hotel room because he knew that's not something his character would have done. And by the time the big day arrived, he was in a very fragile headspace. Wahlberg also wanted to play his sequence in the nude, but since that wouldn't fly with Disney, a compromise of some nasty tighty-whities was made. After Donnie admitted that he didn't even remember shooting the first take, but he was so impressive that Bruce made a speech to the entire crew, praising Donnie's efforts. For his part, Haley was pretty committed to his job as well. During one scene where he had to get into the right headspace quickly, the young actor started to throw himself into a door in order to feel wounded. Naturally, no one saw this alarming moment, as they most certainly would have stopped him. After all, 10 is far too young to be going method. Haley had himself a dedicated collaborator in Bruce Willis, who was in awe of the young actor's talent, that he used those emotions while in character to depict Malcolm's fascination with Cole. For Knight's part, the trick of working with Haley was to treat him as a normal actor, not a child actor. As Haley was so precocious, he could be handled being treated as if he were an adult. Key to Haley's performance was Knight's insistence that he didn't play Cole as pathetic, instead wanting Cole to express emotions of anger and fear. He wanted Cole to be a fighter, not just a sad little boy. Filming on The Sixth Sense concluded in November of 1998. On its way to an August 1999 release, Disney screened the film to about 1,000 people one night to a crowd that was evidently fully engaged with it. At one point during the screening, something happened with the projector and the film started wobbling. Knight's editor, who was sitting next to him, advised him to go up to the booth and tell them to stop the film, but Knight declined, sensing, pun intended, that the audience was so with this movie that they didn't care. Turned out he was right. When the movie was over, the audience sat in stunned silence, and the multiple Disney execs in attendance probably thought that they had a bomb on their hands for a minute or so. But it was a testament to the film and its knockout ending that the moviegoers were simply digesting what they'd just experienced. Disney put a lot of advertising power behind the movie, which at the beginning of the summer wasn't exactly thought of as a major player, releasing on August 6th against competition like The Iron Giant and The Thomas Crown Affair, not to mention the second wide weekend of The Blair Witch Project. The Sixth Sense surprised with a very good $26 million opening. But what impressed more was what happened next. In its second weekend, it made $25 million, dropping a minuscule 3%. It remained consistent, dropping just a little bit week after week. It had become a must-see movie of the year, maybe of the past few years. All in all, Shyamalan's film finished its domestic box office run with $293 million, which placed it in the top 10 domestic box office earners of all time for a while. It ultimately made $672 million worldwide. Knight had bet on himself, and it turned out he was absolutely correct to do so. Then came the awards. The thriller found itself an unlikely dark horse at the 72nd Academy Awards, earning 6 Oscar nominations for Best Picture, Director, Screenplay, Editing, and Supporting Actor for Osment, and Supporting Actress for Toni Collette. 11 at the time, Osment is still amongst the youngest nominees in Oscar history. The film went home empty-handed that night, but its legacy had already been cemented. M. Night Shyamalan has had a roller coaster of a career since 1999, filled with the kinds of highs and lows that you'd expect from someone who found worldwide fame after an unexpected massive hit. While his filmography can be considered inconsistent, his name still carries plenty of weight in the industry. If he ever manages to reach the heights of Sixth Sense again remains to be seen, but there's no questioning that he put his imprint on the genre forever with The Sixth Sense, which made horror fans out of even the most timid. In 2002, M. Night Shyamalan had already done the impossible in Hollywood. He was a director who became a household name. At the time, you could probably only say that about a handful of directors. You know, the usual suspects: Spielberg, Scorsese, Tarantino, maybe a few select others. But after the blockbuster success of 1999's The Sixth Sense, which became one of the biggest movies of all time, not to mention a Best Picture nominee, Shyamalan was now a brand. 1 year after The Sixth Sense, Shyamalan brought us Unbreakable, a brooding, suspenseful drama about a man who's burdened with a great responsibility that he doesn't even know about. To say it was an unusual take on the superhero genre would be an understatement, and as hard as it is to believe, superhero movies were not a thing when Unbreakable came out. So the movie, while respected and destined to build a loyal following, was not held in the same regard as Knight's breakout hit. So what was the still young director going to do to prove the cultural touchstone that was The Sixth Sense was not simply a fluke? He'd have to make another roller coaster ride for an audience eager for original storytelling. That's how this 2002 film was born, and so we're going to find out just what happened to Signs.
It won't be convincing. It doesn't sound natural when I curse.
Just make noises then.
Ah! I'm insane with anger! We're gonna beat your ass, bitch! I'm losing my mind! We're gonna tear your head off! It's time for an ass whipping!
I cursed.
I heard.
Knight had complicated feelings about the somewhat muted reaction to Unbreakable, which he himself described as a movie filled with burdens. Both Sixth Sense and Unbreakable, while not without their fun moments, are movies with overtly somber atmospheres. Believe it or not, it was a trip to Denny's that helped spur on Signs. In an interview conducted some years later, Knight described being in a Denny's and seeing a family having a very serious meal, before noticing another couple sitting in silence. Knight found that he wanted to make those people, or anyone who was going through a rough patch, feel better. He called Disney, which had produced Sixth Sense and Unbreakable, and told them that he wanted to make a movie that was joyous, almost childlike in its point of view. It would still have conflict in it, but it wouldn't carry the weight of the world on its shoulders, the way his past two movies seemed to. He trained himself not to write his new script if he was feeling uptight or unsettled. He'd only want to work on it during his lighthearted moods, conjuring up one fun idea after the other. Ultimately, Knight said Signs was the easiest script that he had ever written. That's food for thought when considering the movie's central plot, which revolves around a minister who has lost his faith in God after the accidental death of his wife. Never one to hide his own faith, Knight saw an opportunity to make a movie about a man's conversation with God, a man who was literally looking for signs from above. With this theme in place, Knight returned to a phenomena he had been quite fascinated by: crop circles. Intrigued by the fact that corn stalks are quite tough to break, Knight reasoned that crop circles just had to have explanations that perhaps weren't terrestrial. Now he had a subgenre to work with: the alien invasion thriller. Knight wasn't interested in telling a big Independence Day style extravaganza though. For him, a smaller, more intimate drama would fit better in with his overall theme of faith in the face of disaster. His main inspirations for the scope of his story would be George A. Romero's iconic siege film Night of the Living Dead, Alfred Hitchcock's classic end-of-the-world thriller The Birds, and Don Siegel's Invasion of the Body Snatchers, with its subtle, powerful suspense and paranoia. Of course, you can throw a little War of the Worlds in there for good measure.
Before we continue with our video, here's a reminder to click the Store tab on any of our JoBlo channels and browse our collection of the latest and freshest designs in our merch store. Go get you some.
The minister at the heart of the narrative, Graham Hess, would not be facing the invasion alone. Shyamalan initially envisioned a large family for Graham to interact with during the crisis, as the event would take place during a busy Thanksgiving gathering at the Hess farm. But Knight ultimately found that he had too many characters on hand, comparing the scenario to the towering inferno, and began to whittle down the amount of characters to just 4. The immediate family consisting of Graham, his brother, and Graham's 2 young children. Knight also had an idea for a teacher character to be involved, imagining his Sixth Sense star Toni Collette in the role, but he eventually cut this character out as well. Additionally, his original idea of filming the entire movie inside the farmhouse was abandoned. He'd allow the characters to venture out once in a while to the neighboring village. Still, this was predominantly going to be a sci-fi epic on a rather small scale. If you believe the rumors, Graham was initially going to be an older man than he ended up being, and Knight supposedly had his sights set on Hollywood royalty for the part. Clint Eastwood was approached to star, but he unfortunately passed on it. Knight then allegedly took the part to Paul Newman, who was in his mid-70s at the time, but Newman also declined the part. Needing a true leading man, Knight turned to Mel Gibson to play a role that was far from his usual heroes in action-heavy blockbusters. As Gibson recalled, he ended up dialing Knight immediately after reading Signs, and said yes to the part. A man of faith himself, Gibson saw the themes of spirituality and belief very clearly in the script, which is what made him want to take it on. Gibson would later say that he's only worked with 3 geniuses in his career: Peter Weir, George Miller, and M. Night Shyamalan. For the secondary role of Merrill, Graham's younger brother, Night offered the part to Mark Ruffalo, who actually accepted. Unfortunately, a few weeks before production was set to begin, Ruffalo had to have surgery on his inner ear, which made his participation in the film impossible. Night turned to Joaquin Phoenix, then just coming off an Oscar nomination for Gladiator. At the time, Phoenix was happy to have a role that was a bit more lighthearted than the ones that he was known for. As he put it, "I didn't get arrested or kill anybody, so that was really good." The two children in the film would go on to be recognizable adult thespians, Rory Culkin and Abigail Breslin. Apparently, the kids were so good at their jobs that they forced their adult co-stars to up their game, especially during the dramatic dinner scene, which the youngsters blew the doors off of. As is the case with all of his films, Night storyboarded the entire thing front to back. Much like a screenplay, Night does different drafts of the storyboards as time goes on, and in total, it takes somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 months for him to complete them all. These he shares with his most trusted collaborators, like cinematographer Tak Fujimoto and composer James Newton Howard. The latter is interesting because Night wants Howard to start working on themes for the film before production has even begun. He wants the composer to work off the story being told, and not necessarily the footage that he's being delivered. So it goes that the iconic and intense theme for the film was composed before principal photography even began. Night wanted a score that was almost Bernard Herrmann-esque in how it's almost visual in its boldness. Night was able to take that theme music to pre-production meetings and play it for his crew, so they knew exactly what kind of movie they'd be making. He also decided to use the theme in the opening credits to give the audience a similar notion of what they were getting into. Production took place, of course, in Night's home state of Pennsylvania, Bucks County to be precise. The production was able to find a perfect place in the form of Delaware Valley Agricultural College, where they actually had cornfields at their disposal. The college even planted more corn for the movie's benefit. The crop circles in the film are indeed real, as Night was then famously averse to using too much CGI, and these formations were shot in upstate New York. The Hess house was built from the ground up right near the college, with interiors that could actually be used, though much of the film's interiors were shot on a soundstage. The house was built in a Victorian style to give it a classic all-American look. Shooting on signs was scheduled to begin September 12, 2001. Yes, the day after 9/11. Night recalls the effects of the tragedy were naturally felt throughout the entire cast and crew. The latter especially, since plenty of crew members were from nearby New York City. Ironically, the first scene shot days after the attacks were perhaps the most dramatic in the film, when Graham speaks to his wife for the last time as she lays dying after her car accident. Night intentionally wanted this to be the first scene shot because it colors everything the Graham character does afterward, and he also wanted Mel Gibson to tackle a highly emotional scene right off the bat. The fact that they ended up shooting this right after 9/11 is almost like some kind of sick cosmic joke. Before shooting, Night and the crew held a candlelight vigil for those who lost their lives on that fateful day. The unfortunate prelude aside, Night would eventually find Signs to be the easiest shoot of his career, even admitting himself that his shoots are usually tortuous. To further involve himself in his work, he made the decision to play a pivotal supporting role, that of the man involved with Graham's wife's accident. Funnily enough, he hadn't told Gibson that he was playing the part, so the star was quite surprised when he found out who his scene partner was going to be. Shyamalan lost his grandfather one day prior to shooting the sequence, which made his raw emotions in it all the more real. The other main players in the film are, naturally, the extraterrestrials themselves, who went through a bit of a transformation over time. Initially, Night saw them as being translucent and able to completely camouflage themselves to the point of invisibility. But early CGI tests disappointed the director, and a revised vision was brought to the table. One that would see the aliens have the ability to blend into their environments, but without going completely invisible. ILM was hired to bring the creatures to life. CGI was utilized for the majority of their bodies, though a practical arm was built for the film's main alien in the memorable pantry sequence. It was again used to hold Rory Culkin's body towards the end of the film. The fact that we barely see the creature was of course by design. The movie's other iconic sequence, that of the birthday party video that reveals the alien in full for the first time, was shot by Knight using an ordinary household camera. It was all done in one take and proved to be the most compelling footage in the entire film. As he's involved in all aspects of his movies, Knight made sure that he was heavily instrumental in how Signs was to be marketed. He allegedly told Disney that he didn't want Mel Gibson's face on the posters because he didn't want the film being pitched as a star vehicle. He preferred the marketing to focus on the mystery and the intrigue of the plot. Furthermore, he didn't want the trailers to say, "From the director of The Sixth Sense," because he wanted the new feature to be sold on its own merits. That said, much of the material leading up to the film's release pitched it as M. Night Shyamalan's Signs. Signs came out on August 2nd, 2002, a little less than a year after production began. It opened with a bang, making $60 million during its first weekend, the second biggest August opening of all time. Critics were generally kind to it, and the audience ate it up. And if it fell short of having the cultural impact that The Sixth Sense had, that's because most movies simply can't achieve such heights. Signs ended its box office run with over $400 million worldwide, a success by most every measure. Looking back, Signs was something of an end of an era for M. Night Shyamalan. His following feature was The Village, which many thought was a huge step backwards for the director. After that came Lady in the Water, another huge blow to the reputation of the man who was at one time thought as the heir to the throne of geniuses like Spielberg and Hitchcock. That said, lucky for us, Knight is still at it, making thrillers and filling us with hope that he can still hit some of those early high notes once again. You can't help but root for the man, who is an artist still determined to show us sights that no one else can. We should have faith that he can still pull it off.
Meryl, swing away.
The early aughts were a very good time to be M. Night Shyamalan. Certainly the best time. Coming off his Oscar-nominated blockbuster, The Sixth Sense, Shyamalan was instantly a household name and recognized as one of the most exciting new filmmakers to come along in years. He was even dubbed the next Spielberg by Newsweek magazine. Knight certainly leaned into this hype, very much enjoyed the accolades and attention, and quickly parlayed the goodwill into a couple of memorable thrillers, 2000's Unbreakable and 2002's Signs. While neither film reached the box office or pop cultural heights that The Sixth Sense did, they were evidence that Shyamalan was indeed a born filmmaker, able to craft genre films that were suspenseful and dramatic in equal measure. After Signs came out, it was hard to find someone who didn't know the name Shyamalan. He was the rare director whose name was as important to the general audience as the stars of the film. Shyamalan would put name recognition to the ultimate test in 2004 with The Village, a movie featuring an ensemble cast of well-known acting veterans who weren't exactly box office gold. Without a Bruce Willis or Mel Gibson to headline the film, Shyamalan would be the biggest name on the poster this time around. He had faith, and all of his movies are about faith one way or another, that his relationship with the audience would persevere. They trusted him to deliver a certain kind of product regardless of who the star was, and he was going to reward that trust with his most twisty movie yet. I mean, he was the star of this particular movie. The results, well, let's just say every relationship has its bumpy roads, and this was the first of many for the director. Pour yourself a glass of unpasteurized milk and hunker down by the campfire, because we're going to find out just what the happened to M. Night Shyamalan's The Village.
Don't let them in.
Before we start in earnest, let's be clear that this video is going to spoil the hell out of The Village. So if by some crazy chance you're unaware of what's really going on deep in those woods, you might want to check out the movie first. Slapping your forehead at some of the movie's outlandish twists is part of the fun after all. The Village was inspired by an unlikely combination of well-known titles, Wuthering Heights and King Kong. Shyamalan was once offered the opportunity to direct an adaptation of Emily Bronte's beloved gothic romance novel, and while considering it, he read the book and fell in love with it. He turned down the opportunity to direct it, but reading Wuthering Heights made him want to try his hand at a film that would be both a period piece and a romance. As he said at the time, he wanted to make a movie about innocence. Simultaneously, he was fascinated by a sequence in King Kong that always stood out to him. As he told the Washington Post in an interview, the most intriguing moment of the film is when we see the rituals that the native tribe of Skull Island goes through to appease the giant animal just beyond their home. Knight was enthralled with the idea of these people living side by side with a monster, and got to thinking about how delicate and fraught with danger such a truce could be. This led to the idea of a small community at the end of the 1800s who developed a peaceful yet stressful accord with a species of vicious creature that roam the woods beyond their village. They don't go into the woods, the creatures don't come into their hamlet. Seems like a decent enough deal, but what would happen if one side or the other started breaking the tenuous agreement? As we eventually find out, the creatures are a ruse by the elders who've decided to shield the children from an unforgiving outside world. They're actually living in modern times, but have put themselves in a bubble of make-believe in order to never face the horrors of modern civilization again. Originally titled The Woods, Shyamalan set the project up once again at Disney, the home of his previous 3 box office hits. While the suits of the studio were somewhat wary of Knight's new project, which seemed to deal in hushed tones as opposed to the popcorn movie-friendly moments of his other movies, they knew Knight was a marquee name that would draw crowds. He was still the genius who could not miss, so Disney agreed to a budget in the range of $60 million for a movie without A-listers or flashy visual effects. Though the movie doesn't unveil its true lead until well into the second half, the first half is a genuine ensemble. Knight wanted to populate his film with well-respected actors from both stage and screen. The role of Lucius, the curious young man who appears at first to be the film's main protagonist, was specifically written with Joaquin Phoenix in mind. Phoenix and Knight were making signs together when the actor told the director that he yearned to perform a role that didn't have much dialogue, where he could give a true performance without having to speak much. Shyamalan obliged him with the role of Lucius, who is quiet and stoic. He also pretty much exits the movie halfway through. For the leading lady, plucky blind teenager Ivy, Shyamalan had his sights set on Spider-Man actress Kirsten Dunst. Dunst couldn't commit to the role, so Shyamalan had to look elsewhere. During a performance of As You Like It in New York, Knight was drawn to the play's lead actress, Bryce Dallas Howard, of course Ron Howard's daughter, but at the time a complete unknown beyond the stage. Without even asking for an audition, Shyamalan offered Bryce the role of Ivy. She accepted, and it ended up being her first performance in a movie. To prepare, Bryce spent a lot of time with blind people in order to study their movements and habits. A May 2013 article in Entertainment Weekly noted that, in addition to Dunst and Phoenix being sought after for The Woods, that 70s show breakout Ashton Kutcher was being looked at for a major role in the film, presumably that of mentally disabled Noah Percy, who plays a large role in the drama that takes place in the village. Kutcher obviously didn't end up being in the film, and instead Shyamalan cast Adrian Brody, then hot off winning an Oscar for The Pianist. Brody would do research beforehand by spending time with people who had similar disabilities as Noah. In significant roles as village elders, Shyamalan cast a bevy of highly respected thespians, including William Hurt, Sigourney Weaver, Brendan Gleeson, and Cherry Jones. In smaller roles, he cast up-and-comers such as Judy Greer, Michael Pitt, and Jesse Eisenberg. Before production, a large portion of the cast spent about a week's time at a boot camp where they learned the crafts of the late 1800s. The actors spent time with historians who taught them how to forge metal, sew, tend to the fields, milk cows, make their own cheese, and so forth. Not only would this bond the cast together, it would make them seem like naturals at these rudimentary tasks once in front of the cameras. Shyamalan had long been a believer in storyboarding just about everything during pre-production, and this time was no different. After hiring celebrated cinematographer Roger Deakins, Knight spent about 3 weeks with Deakins storyboarding the entire film. Both men were sticklers for even the smallest of details, so they ended up being a natural pairing. The two were heavily inspired by the works of painter Andrew Wyeth. Like Shyamalan, a native of Pennsylvania, Wyeth was known for his stark, eerie paintings of rural people and landscapes. Ironically, the village would actually end up shooting not far from where he grew up. Production settled on Chadds Ford Township, Pennsylvania, about 25 miles southwest of Philadelphia. Creepily enough, the 600-acre piece of land had long been associated with urban legends around that area, including tales of satanic cults and spooky apparitions. It took some 300 people to build the titular village from the ground up. Some of the houses functioned inside and out, while others were just exteriors and de facto storage facilities. Soon after shooting commenced, the entire village was taken down and the land returned to its prior serene state. Shooting on the village lasted approximately 2.5 months, although production was in hazard of being shut down for a long period of time thanks to a blizzard that came out of nowhere and dumped about 14 inches of snow on the area one day. Luckily, that snow didn't last long after nearby Hurricane Isabel washed it all away, but the production was left dealing with very soggy and muddy conditions for much of the shoot. The movie faced a hazard of a different kind soon after. Despite the extra security required on any Shyamalan project, the film's script was leaked out and wound up on several online entertainment sites well before the film's release. The pre-reviews, as they were called, were critical of many of the script's elements, including the hokey dialogue and some easily guessed twists. Shyamalan and Disney forged ahead regardless, keeping the movie as it was, save for some quick reshoots a few months before the movie's release, which included the film's final shot, that of Ivy returning from her journey to greet the fallen Lucius. Midway through the film, Lucius gets a surprising stabbing from the heartbroken Noah, a moment that changes the course of the story and sets up Ivy to be the actual hero of the tale. This very brief moment almost caused the village to get an R rating. It wasn't because it was too gory either. It was the sound of the knife slipping into Lucius that was apparently so disturbing to the MPAA that they slapped the movie with an R rating. After the sound was removed, it was given a PG-13. And to think, some people say this organization is ridiculous.
Hi, I'm Some People.
The Village released on July 30th, 2004. Reviews from critics were quite mixed, but the opening weekend was a banquet for Knight and Disney, as the film grossed $50 million in its first 3 days. If nothing else, this seemed to prove that Shyamalan was just as much as a draw as any headliner in Hollywood. However, the good times would stop rolling during its second weekend, when the film dropped a calamitous 67%, signaling that this particular bag of tricks was not to the audience's liking. But all was not lost, as ultimately the movie grossed $256 million worldwide, meaning despite its hasty reputation as a misguided bomb, it wound up being profitable. There was still one more trial to overcome for The Village soon after its release. A lawsuit was threatened by author Margaret Peterson Haddix and her publisher Simon & Schuster after they found one too many similarities between Knight's film and Haddix's book Running Out of Time. Published in 1995, 9 years before The Village's release, Running Out of Time is about a young girl living in an isolated village who discovers it's not actually the mid-1800s, but 1995. She's been lied to her entire life about her surroundings and the outside world by the village's elders, pretty close in spirit to the village's big reveal. But ultimately, there was no lawsuit filed, most likely because Disney would have thrown all the money in the world at it. When all was said and done, The Village was an ambitious misstep for the previously infallible Shyamalan. Disney head honcho Nina Jacobson later theorized that the reason for the movie's tumble was that he'd lied to the audience, and that he didn't respect them. Perhaps the twist at the end was a bridge too far, or maybe it was just because there was nothing supernatural going on after all. Unlike the ending of The Sixth Sense, this wasn't one you made sure to avoid spoiling, one that you told people that they had to see to believe. This time you simply said, don't waste your money. Things quickly changed for Knight after The Village. His next movie, Lady in the Water, was an even bigger swing and miss, made for a different studio, because Disney no longer trusted his vision. In recent years, Knight has been self-financing smaller budgeted fare. Though his name still rings out, it's not like it was some 20 years ago, when the name Shyamalan signaled a must-see event. Regardless of what you think of his films, you must admit Knight is still a unique voice in the filmmaking world. He did not end up being the next Spielberg, but there's still only one M. Night Shyamalan.